Every year, the world's oceans are plundered by fleets chasing fewer and fewer fish. But one fleet stands out, not just for its size, but for the political weight it carries. From the rich resources of the South China Sea to the shark-rich waters near the Galapagos Islands, Chinese fishing vessels are showing up all over the globe. And in their wake are diplomatic protests, military standoffs, and environmental alarm. At first glance, these are just fishermen, casting nets and hauling in catches. But behind them lies something much larger. A global strategy, quietly reshaping maritime boundaries and testing the limits of international law. Coastal nations say their waters are being invaded, environmentalists warn of ecological collapse, and international courts struggle to hold anyone accountable. This is not just about fish, it's about power, sovereignty, and who gets to decide what happens in the world's oceans. This is how one nation's fishing fleet has become a flashpoint in geopolitics, and why the fight over fish may shape the future of the seas. Before you can fully understand the impact of these Chinese fishing fleets, you must first understand the legal structure that surrounds the discussion. Most people think of political borders as something that stops at the edge of a country's land, but the reality is that those borders stretch far into the ocean, and they're governed by one of the most important, yet least understood international agreements in the world. It's called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Created in 1982, it's the legal framework that tells countries where their control over the ocean begins and where it ends. And that matters because what's under the water isn't just fish, it's oil, gas, there's shipping lanes, and national security. UNCLOS divides the ocean into 4 main zones, each giving countries different rights. The territorial sea is the first 12 nautical miles from a country's coast, and here the rules are simple. That stretch of water is treated just like land. The country has full control over what happens here, from fishing and shipping to military activity. Beyond that, from 12 to 24 nautical miles is the contiguous zone. It's a buffer zone where countries can still enforce laws on things like customs or immigration, but they don't have full sovereignty. Then comes the exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, stretching up to 200 nautical miles from the coast. This is where things get serious. A country has exclusive rights to all natural resources in its EEZ. That means fishing, drilling, and mining are off limits to outsiders. Other nations can pass through, but they can't touch what's below. And finally, beyond 200 miles are the high seas, a kind of international commons. No country owns it, anyone can fish there, sell there, or do research, but everyone is still supposed to follow international law. So what if a country has islands? Islands owned by a country need to meet specific criteria before they can act as extensions of a country's EEZ. But just know that if an island controlled by that country actively has citizens living on it, then by the rules of UNCLOS, they can actually extend a country's EEZ, or give the country a small EEZ that's separated from the country's mainland. This is important because it shows that political power doesn't stop at the shore. It stretches across oceans, shaping conflicts over who gets to claim resources, protect borders, or control trade routes. And when countries disagree, say over a disputed island or a fishing ground, it's UNCLOS that's supposed to keep the peace. Now hopefully you understand how this international law works, but let me show you when it doesn't work. On paper it makes sense, and in most real-world situations it is functional. But there is one region on Earth that has been more troublesome than others, and that's the South China Sea. The South China Sea is one of the most hotly contested bodies of water on the planet. According to international law, specifically UNCLOS, many countries have the right to fish and explore resources within 200 nautical miles of their coastlines. That's their exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, but China sees things differently. Beijing claims nearly the entire sea based on what's called the 9-dash line, a vague historic boundary that overlaps with the EEZs of several Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines. In 2012, tensions over this 9-dash line boiled over between the Chinese and Philippine governments. A group of Chinese fishing boats was spotted near the Scarborough Shoal, a rich fishing ground well within the Philippine EEZ. When the Philippine Navy moved in to inspect, Chinese maritime vessels showed up and didn't leave. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted weeks. Eventually, Chinese ships stayed, and that area effectively came under China's control, not through force, but through mere presence. The Philippines took the issue to international court, and in 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled clearly China's claims had no legal basis. Scarborough Shoal was within the Philippines' EEZ, but China ignored the ruling, dismissed it as invalid, and kept its ships in place. Today, Filipino fishermen are routinely blocked or harassed when they try to access waters that under international law belong to them. Despite this region's case, the law of the sea is a mostly functional rule that is followed by most states around the world, but just like any rule, purposely or not, it gets broken. China's fishing ambitions don't stop at the South China Sea. Its fleet stretches across the globe into waters thousands of miles from home, and it's stirring up tensions with countries you'd least expect. China runs the world's largest distant water fishing fleet, sending thousands of vessels across international waters in search of seafood. And in many cases, these boats are accused of what's called IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. In recent years, two countries, Ecuador and Argentina, have found themselves right in the path of this maritime expansion, and the fallout has been dramatic. In 2020, Ecuadorian officials noticed something unusual near the Galapagos Islands, a massive wall of Chinese fishing vessels just outside Ecuador's exclusive economic zone. Over 300 boats lined up edge to edge formed what some described as a floating city in the middle of the Pacific. They stayed just outside Ecuador's jurisdiction, close enough to exploit rich marine life, but far enough to stay out of legal trouble. Ecuador couldn't prove that these vessels had entered its EEZ, but the data told another story. Satellite tracking and ecological reports showed endangered species like hammerhead sharks disappearing in huge numbers. One 2020 cargo inspection in Panama uncovered over 26 tons of shark fins, many of them traced back to the Galapagos region. Now these trawlers weren't using nets, they were using long lines and industrial scale gear that dragged in everything they could, right up to the edge of what was legal. So Ecuador fought back with tech. In 2023, they partnered with a Canadian company to deploy radar satellite monitoring, allowing it to track ships in real time, even at night or through clouds. By June, they had flagged over more than 150 vessels suspected of illegal fishing inside protected waters. It was a turning point in Ecuador's ability to defend its marine territory. Now, Argentina's approach was a bit different, but much more direct. Between 2016 and 2022, the Argentine Coast Guard intercepted and in some cases sank Chinese vessels operating illegally inside its EEZ. The most dramatic case came in March 2016 when the Lu Yan Yu ignored repeated warnings, tried to flee, and even attempted to ram the patrol ship. The Coast Guard opened fire, the vessel sank, but most of the crew was rescued by nearby Chinese boats. And the pressure hasn't stopped. By 2024, Argentina was facing a new wave of foreign fleets hovering right outside their waters, from China, but also from Spain, South Korea, and Taiwan. This time, Argentina sent in the Navy and Air Force to track and deter them. Officials called it a growing threat to both the environment and national security. And these aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a much bigger pattern. Chinese fleets have been reported off the coasts of Peru, Chile, and Mexico using similar tactics where they operate near or inside other countries' EEZs. For nations with small navies and limited resources, there's no easy way to push back. And it's not just about sovereignty, it's about ecosystems. The Galapagos Islands are one of the most biodiverse marine environments in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The loss of marine life there has ripple effects across entire oceanic systems. These cases make one thing clear: China's fishing fleet isn't just changing who catches the fish, it's changing how power is exercised at sea. It's testing international law, overwhelming local enforcement, and leaving environmental damage in its wake. And the biggest problem? There's no global body with the authority or the muscle that's willing to stop it. By now it's clear that China's global fishing fleet isn't just about food or commerce, it's strategic, it's deliberate. And in many cases, these fishing boats aren't just fishing, they're part of something much bigger. They're part of a maritime militia. On paper, these are civilian vessels, but in practice, they function more like an unofficial navy. They're state-funded, they coordinate with China's maritime authorities, and they're often shadowed or supported by the Chinese Coast Guard. And their mission is to assert China's maritime claims, crowd out foreign vessels, and quietly expand Chinese control without even having to fire a shot. The key to their effectiveness is ambiguity. Officially known as the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, this isn't some ragtag group of rogue operators. It's organized, trained, and in many cases directed by China's regional military with oversight from the Central Military Commission. These vessels don't carry flags or uniforms, they look like any other fishing boats, but that's the point. By operating in a legal gray zone, they can push boundaries literally and figuratively without triggering the rules that govern military engagement. It's projection of power under a civilian mask. And nowhere is this tactic more visible than in the South China Sea. Chinese vessels frequently swarm disputed areas like the Spratly Islands or Scarborough Shoals and Whitsun Reef, sometimes by the hundreds. In 2021, more than 200 Chinese boats dropped anchor at Whitsun Reef inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. China claimed they were taking shelter from bad weather, but they didn't move. No fishing, no storms, just a static formation, sitting there for weeks while Filipino fishermen were being pushed out. Fast forward to June 2024. According to The Guardian, dozens of Chinese vessels, again suspected militia, surrounded a Philippine Coast Guard ship at Scarborough Shoal. They reportedly used water cannons. The message wasn't subtle. China is willing to use intimidation to enforce its territorial claims, and it's doing it with the ships that technically don't belong in its navy. This is what's known as a gray zone conflict. It's not outright war, but it's not peace either. It's something in between that's designed to make response difficult. If you confront them, you risk escalation. If you don't, you cede control. And it's not just happening in Southeast Asia. Chinese fishing fleets that are sometimes accompanied by surveillance ships are showing up in the Indian Ocean, raising alarms in Sri Lanka and India. In the Pacific, island nations like Palau and Micronesia have reported vessels loitering near their waters, and they're oftentimes suspected of gathering intelligence. Many of these ships are fitted with dual-use tech, radar, satellite links, and even reinforced hulls. They're built to last and built for more than just fishing. A 2018 report from the US Department of Defense described the Maritime Militia as an armed reserve force disguised as fishermen. So this isn't just about who gets to fish where, it's about who gets to write the rules of maritime power. The militia doesn't just fish, it occupies, and over time, the occupation creates a new reality. Presence becomes power, and power becomes control. For smaller nations, it creates a near impossible choice. These aren't warships, but if you do nothing, your sovereignty slowly erodes, and once these fleets establish themselves, they don't leave. So what started as a legal dispute in the South China Sea has evolved into something much larger. Chinese fishing vessels now stretch across the globe, claiming territory, straining ecosystems, and testing the limits of international law. In Latin America, they hover just outside national waters, vacuuming up marine life and overwhelming smaller coast guards. In Asia, they operate as a shadow force, civilian in name, strategic in function. And everywhere they go, they reveal the same thing. The rules of the sea are being bent, challenged, or ignored entirely. The oceans were once thought of as a global commons, shared, protected, and regulated. But today they're becoming arenas of quiet conflict, where power is asserted one fishing boat at a time. And the world has a choice: strengthen the rules and the institutions that protect those waters, or watch as the law of the sea becomes the law of the strongest.